And so for things like the synth parts that are on this latest album, do you have those in mind as you're writing, or do you pre-plan like wanting to have like a more atmospheric section, or does it come up pretty organically? Do you reach a point where like, well, it would be cool to have an atmospheric section here, or it makes sense to have a synth part here?
It's always organic. The synth on this album was honestly a real surprise. I had an idea that I wanted to do it, and I have never programmed synth before. I knew that I wanted to do it. I had a sense of some things, I had a sense that I wanted the 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 choir, the real choir sounding synth parts in certain black metal sections to evoke a very classic, dramatic black metal, just like black metal feel. So for certain parts, there wasn't it. They didn't require a ton of thought. It was really like, oh, I can hear these riffs. This is a cool part sonically. There's a little gap in the space. I can add in a synth choir here and really fill it out, really add to some drama. And you hear that in a lot of the songs, really heavily in the first track and in the last, and really all over the place. But then some of the others, those were a lot of experimentation where I used them to accomplish different effects, like kind of emotional or dramatic effects. So there are certain spots where I use a kind of distant, delicate sounding synth to evoke the sense of, a far off voice, or a far off sad melody. Or I use horns in a lot of sections to for different reasons, but it's usually something very literal, where it's, in the fifth track there are horns, and the lyrics and then the verse immediately after remark far off trumpets blare. And so I find that the synth offered a level of melodic and thematic I don't know, palette that just let me kind of like extend and elaborate on certain ideas. And then I guess the real one I'm missing, and that you probably are curious about, the long synth break in the last song. That was actually Lev's idea. I had made a commitment to myself that I didn't want the synth to really be the focal point. The synth was always there. Maybe I would compromise and say, like, okay, this spot, the riff is doing a thing. I can use the synth to build on this, and it'll be the focus. It'll be the lead. The synth break in that song was very much Lev, which is very strange because Lev is the most anti-synth metal purist I've ever met, and he was the one who suggested it. And I'm really glad he did. Really glad he did.
So as you mentioned, Legacies of Frailty was released at the end of September through Vendetta Records. How do you compare Legacies to your previous albums? What would you say makes this one different besides the synth parts?
So I think that there are a few things. This is by far the most focused and deliberate of all of them. Deliberate in the sense that there was nothing really accidental. There was nothing that I hadn't considered in some capacity. And on previous albums, which isn't to say that previous albums were unconsidered, but there were things on previous albums where sometimes I'd think, oh, it's good enough, or, oh, it's just a bridge riff, it's fine, or, it's fine. That's just the way the song came out. We're going to go with it. It's fine. With this one, it was very, very focused and obsessive, and I wanted to come out sounding like this and this riff doesn't capture the feeling I'm looking for, or this vocal take isn't doing it for me, so I'm just going to do it the fuck again. So that was it. The level of detail and attention that went into everything was a lot higher. The sort of single-mindedness that I took to a lot of the songs and the riffs was amplified. I mean, on Hope Attrition, I think there's a real big difference between Hope Attrition and Withdrawal, the album that came before it. And that Hope Attrition really turned up the black metal. I recommitted to it. Legacies of Frailty is even more so. I very deliberately purged influences that I thought didn't achieve my vision of black metal that I had for this album. And which meant that I was discarding riffs that were good riffs because they simply didn't fit. They didn't drop into the schema that I had. They did not amplify the feeling and the message that I was trying to get across at any given time. And obviously, there's some variation between the songs. The songs don't all sound like the same song over and over again. And I think that we could say the pendulum swings between aggressive and melodic on this album. And some songs are more on one side, some are more on the other. But in general, it is where song structures and where riffs are concerned, from my perspective, it's the most narrowly scoped and single-minded, which is funny because the addition of synth at the same time turns it into probably the most ambitious and has more experimental pieces on it than any album since the second, where it's this foundation of primitive, narrow-minded, some would say repetitive, exhausting black metal with these occasionally delicate sounds over top of them, with leitmotifs that appear and disappear, with lyrics that call out to the vocals, with a narrative arc, starting from beginning to end. So in a lot of ways, it's my most primitive and simple and narrow-minded, but also my most ambitious and dynamic, and the has elements on it that I was more, not nervous, but they felt like more of a departure than anything I had done in a long time. So, on top of that, it's, of course, I think it's the fastest. It's the most riffy. I am taking my guitar playing much more seriously than I ever did before, and I wanted a riffs album. It is a riffs album. And, I think that I'm proud of all the Woe albums. They all have riffs that I like quite a bit, but this one I set out to really step everything up. So I think this is a very long rambling answer. I'm sorry, but I think that overall it's, I think it's the most extreme of all of them in really every way. And I'm quite proud of that.
You mentioned a narrative arc. Is this a concept album?
Yes.
Do you want to speak a little bit of what the concept is?
Yeah, sure. So Legacies of Frailty, it explores the idea of civilization. I mean, it sounds so dramatic, but it explores the idea of civilization's battle with and failure to address long-standing. It deals with our civilization's inability to really defeat certain regressive ideas or our own regressive nature. It's very much an album about the conflict between progress and the forces that try to kind of pull us backwards. It's never explicitly stated what that means, and I think like for me, I wrote it thinking very much about the rise of nationalism and the rise of extremism, the rise of like a certain kind of like crude populism that tries to tap into a general sense of discontent and weaponizes people's fear and sense of uncertainty and senses of insecurity, and it weaponizes them against the civilization itself. So it starts sort of chronologically with this thing awakening, this thing that we thought was long defeated, and it returns, and we see that people don't fight it. There are people who embrace it, and there are people who see it as an opportunity to fill the holes in their own emptiness and dissatisfaction with life. We then see that turning into a mob where people embrace the violence and conflict, and they start to define themselves by it. And we see that this superficial sense of, we had this pride and this sense of, we're evolved and we're moving forward, and then we're confronted with the reality that inside so many of our friends and families and neighbors and ourselves, there's this primitive cruelty just waiting to be exploited. We then talk about the realities of war that comes as a result of it, very much written thinking about Ukraine and the Russian terrorist aggression against them. It then moves into a sense of defeat, a sense of, we all recognize that it's a problem, but no one can do anything about it. This sort of inertia that we see in the slow song. And then we finally end by looking at the future. So far beyond the fracture of the sky, we look towards the future and we ask, what will there be to inherit? And we talk about the world that will be left as a result of this, and it asks that question, and it describes a world no child dares explore, thinking about the next generation and just what we've left for them.